I remember I was listening to a story from an Ethiopian diakon online once. And there was the story about a confessional father who was having a conversation with a parishioner. And the story is kind of, you could say, funny in a way. There's a little bit of Semitic humor in there, right? But the seminar that the Ethiopian diakon was giving was on, like, functional philosophy, right? Functional philosophy being, like, this very opposite of like a Plotinus or a Platonic way of viewing things. Like, oh, that thing is the way it is all the time, no matter where, when, how. Like, it just is what it is. Functional philosophy pretty much just says that depending on how the thing is used, depending on how it's used, gives it its if it's good for the moment or bad for that moment, right? I use this analogy all the time, right? For example, a knife, right? A knife is neither inherently good nor inherently bad, but depending on the user in that moment, it depends on, like, whether it's good or bad. Like, for example, somebody can use a knife for physical harm, right? But also, I could use a knife to, help with my culinary feats, such as, like, spreading my jam, cutting my sandwich, use it as a scooper for something. Or shoot, even sometimes I've even seen people use blades to, remove the bark from trees and stuff like that, So a knife is useful at times. Back on topic. So this story that the Ethiopian diakon was giving was about this confessional father and one of the parishioners in church. So the man, he goes up to the confessional father and he asks him a question. He goes, "Father, how do I grow in humility?" And the confessional father, he kind of looked at him weird and kind of laughed a little bit. And he was like, "What you mean, how do you grow in humility?" Right? It's like, no, the way you grow in humility, right? If you want to grow in humility, you need to shrink, right? If you want to grow in humility, you shrink, okay? You shrink, right? If you want to grow in humility, you have to go lower, you have to shrink, right? And it's funny because the initial response was, "What you mean grow in humility?" Right, from the confessional father. He's like, "What do you mean grow?" Right? It's like that's a contradictory question. And as funny as this story was, right? There's a truth in there. To grow in humility, you have to shrink. You know, and it's in life that the way that we get more humble, especially, as we get older, it's through our life experiences. No, I definitely used to be somebody that hated, the fact that, like, I had elders who were always using, like, experience, to try and one up me, and stuff like that. And I still am that type of person where I don't think that, just because you're older means that you have a one up on me, right? But rather, I make that judgment based off of, okay, how much have you experienced? Those are the types of people I have respect for, not this idea of, oh, just because you're older than me, then you are due respect. Like, no, I've seen older people who do dumb stuff. I'll be honest, right? But those folks who have experienced a lot, and have gained wisdom from those experiences, those types of people, I would say, like, are the embodiment of what that confessional father was getting at. The fact that they've had these experiences and they've been humbled by these experiences of, like, them falling on their bums, or scraping their knee, whatever kind of experience it may be, and it changed them for the better. Like, those types of folks are the embodiment of what this confessional father was getting at. And I think at times, I think back on my time as an evangelical with my peers at the time, and I would always hear this very thing from my peers, right? They would always, like, reference, they may not have known the verse or the chapter, but I knew what they were getting at, right? They would always talk about, like, oh, I'm on milk. I want to be on the strong food. Like, they want to be able to move on to the more mature things of the faith. The thing is, those things don't come without, experience. Without time, without, what I like to call seasoning, right? If you know what I mean, right? There's a little distinction between somebody who's old and somebody who's seasoned, you know what I mean? Like, old just means, like, all right, you old, like you aged, you know. Seasoned means like not just that you older, but like, you know what I'm saying, the fact that you're older and you got a little bit of wisdom to offer, like, okay, all right, you seasoned. You know what I'm saying? Like you didn't waste your years. But I would always hear my peers like, you know, talk about this whole like moving from milk to, you know, strong food, or, you know, from meat. You know, if you look in Hebrews chapter 5 to 6, you know, where Paul he talks about this. But what they would always miss was that's not for you to decide, right? That's not for you to decide on whether or not you get to move on to that. Just as an infant on command cannot say, all right, I'm ready for strong food, teeth grow, and now I'm ready for steak. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, that's not how it works. An infant, when you look at an infant, right, it takes time for this infant to grow, right? Let alone, you know, experience of growing teeth, you know, the teething process, if they can handle it or not, right? So in the same way it works with spiritual matriculation, especially with Christians, right? Us as Christians. The way that this works is, you know, you cannot move on to the mature things quickly, right? They take time. I think a lot of times, especially online too, you know, in these online communities, I think a lot of people bite off more than they can chew. And, you know, I don't think they necessarily take into account the accountability of learning the very things that, you know, come with, you know, diving into theology, philosophy, metaphysics, and things of that nature. You know, I don't think they really grasp that stuff. You know, I think they hear all of these, you know, terms and big words, and, you know, look at the connection between all of this stuff, that they want to jump from point A to Z. You know, where it's like, no, dude, you gotta understand and master the basics first. And how can you move on to the stuff? How can you move on to the bigger things if you haven't even handled the basics yet? And a lot of this stuff requires humility. You know, most of, you know, if I'm being honest, the most wisest and most like knowledgeable people that I've met in my life of being a Christian have been people who, if I'm being honest, are humble. What I had found out about my peers at the time, you know, in my time of being an evangelical, it wasn't that like, you know, they, you know, just wanted to move on to strong food and things like that. What they wanted was to, you know, eagerly, you know, be this, you know, seasoned Christian, you know, but with that, you know, they kind of rejected the very thing that turns you into that, which is time. You know, time, experience, you know, patience. And in a time where, you know, people want things like that, you know, no thanks to ourselves, it does make sense, you know, why people would, you know, want to speed up a spiritual matriculation process, you know? All that is to say is, you know, in order to be able to handle big things of the faith, you know, humility is important, you know? Humility is very, very important. And that's something that I've learned and that I'm still learning. And not just how much, but, you know, to always be humble, you know? But yeah, man.